7 out of 10 murder victims in the United Kingdom are men. 9 out of 10 perpetrators of murder are men. This is a male phenomenon, but the main reason people commit murder in this country is because in 5 minutes of madness, a young man will lash out at another young man whom he feels has disrespected him. Hello, my name's David Wilson. I'm Emeritus Professor of Criminology, and I'm here to answer questions in the honesty box. How can you spot a psychopath? Psychopaths don't have horns on their head or a long pointed tail. If it was that easy, it would be easy to spot a psychopath. But psychopaths are very good at mirroring your behavior. Psychopaths are very good at being plausible. Psychopaths are very good about being charming. But effectively, you spot a psychopath because the psychopath needs to get close to you as quickly as possible. Because if he gets close to you and learns about you, he's able to use that knowledge to manipulate you, because by manipulating you, he's able to live off you. Psychopaths are very parasitical. They don't want to expend too much energy, and therefore they can live off you by knowing the buttons to press, the way to impress you, the way to get money out of you. The label gets used very commonly in our culture, but only 1 in 100 people would be clinically diagnosed as a psychopath. So it's a very rare phenomenon. And of those 1 out of every 100 who would be diagnosed as such, 9 out of 10 would be male as opposed to female. So this is a very, very rare phenomenon as opposed to the way that we just talk about it all the time. Why do serial killers kill? Often it's because, in my experience, they like power, and often it's a sense of power that they feel is denied to them in other aspects of their lives, and therefore by killing they are exercising a godlike power. They decide who should live and who should die. And of course, why do they kill? It's not so much that one should be asking, it's why are some serial killers killing cycle longer than other serial killers killing cycle? And that's about policing, that's about the fact that we've got to care, that's about the fact that we've got to understand that serial killers will target particular groups in our culture who are vulnerable to attack. And it seems to me our responsibility is to try and lessen those vulnerabilities. Is it true psychopaths mimic emotion? And the answer to that is yeah, that's exactly what they do. Psychopaths have defective emotional experiences. They don't know what sadness is. They don't know what happiness is. They know that you're sad or you're happy because they're very good at reading you. So if you're crying, they understand that sadness. If you're smiling and happy and you're ha 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 laughing, they understand that's a different emotion. But they don't feel those emotions. They merely mimic those emotions. They're a very good mirror, so they want to get close to you. They want to make you feel that they are like you. So they are very good at mimicking emotions. I mean, one of my best friends is a clinically diagnosed psychopath. And he's called Noel. And Noel always says to me, you know, I didn't know why people cried at the end of Titanic. He just didn't get it. He doesn't have those emotions. But he knew everybody else was sad, but he didn't feel that sadness. It's a real tragedy, isn't it? I mean, imagine not being able to have genuine joy, being able to experience what being joyous really feels like. Everybody loves thinking that their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their next door neighbor is a psychopath. You know, it isn't like that. It is a very rare clinical condition. So just be aware of that. Are people born evil? This is such a good question, because even though I'm not religious, I have a secular view of evil, and I do believe in evil. And I've certainly met people that I would happily label as such. We're into one of the classic questions of forensic psychology, or indeed criminology. Are we born or are we made? I always answer that question by saying it's a messy combination of the two. And we might be born in a way that we have a propensity for violence, but how we are nurtured, how we are raised, the relationship that we have with our parents, with our siblings, with our extended family, with friends, how we are nurtured can ameliorate those things that we are born with, or indeed it can make them, it can aggravate them, it can make them much worse. I thought about that question relatively recently because of Axel Rudakabana, and it was quite clear that when he was younger, his parents had been able to manage, control, help with the problems that this young man had. But when he became a teenager, when he was no longer under the influence of his parents as he had once been, the more problematic aspects of his personality were given full rein. Is Lucy Letby a psychopath? Well, she said very little publicly because, of course, she's pleaded not guilty and is still maintaining her innocence after her conviction. And therefore, it's very difficult to know enough about her to be able to do her psychopathy checklist on her. The interesting thing I feel about Lucy Letby is just how polarizing she is. There are still people who are maintaining her innocence, and a lot of those people are professional people. They're doing it with the best intentions. They believe there's been a miscarriage of justice. That in itself is really, really interesting. And of course, in terms of the research that I did about nurses that will kill in a hospital setting, she is an outlier. She didn't make her colleagues feel particularly nervous to be around her, with one or two exceptions. She doesn't quite fit in terms of the red flags that one would normally associate with nurses that would kill in a hospital setting. And she's middle class, she's nice, she's got a sing-songy name. Even one of the detectives who worked on the case described her as beige. And I think people find it difficult to get their head around the fact that she could possibly be a serial killer, to which I usually reply, our most prolific serial killer was a trusted local GP in Manchester who murdered 215, perhaps as many as 260 of his largely female elderly patients. When Harold Shipman was first arrested and charged with murder, the other patients in his practice set up a Harold Shipman legal fighting fund to pay for his legal expenses. Again, it's interesting to me because of the argument that I made about, the vulnerability of some groups to be attacked by serial killers. The service he was offering that no other doctor offered in Manchester was home visits. Harold Shipman was often the only person who was visiting those elderly people from one week to the next, which is also one of the reasons why so often when they were murdered in their home, they were wearing their best clothes. They dressed up because the doctor was coming to call. So I don't know. I wouldn't be able to diagnose if Lucy Letby is a psychopath, but she is quite clearly our most recent female British serial killer, and our most recent male British serial killer is Stephen Port, who murdered gay men. What is something all serial killers have in common? Well, they all have in common that they'll target specific groups of people. I've worked with so many serial murderers that people always are fascinated. Did they have the McDonald triad of bedwetting, fire starting, being cruel to animals? people are always obsessed by, is there something in the biology of the individual serial killer? And as I keep saying, perhaps, but actually what's more interesting is who it is that they're able to kill. I move from that medical psychological tradition to a structural tradition that looks at the people that get targeted by serial murderers. Because if we look at those victim groups, we're much more likely to be able to reduce the incidence of serial murder as opposed to focusing in on the individual biology or personality of the serial killers. The main reason people commit crime, this is my specialist subject. Murder in this country, think of it as being on a continuum. At one end of that continuum, at the extreme end, we've got serial murder, okay? That's the extreme end that way. At the other end, we've got a typical murder. And that typical murder in this country, and the main reason people commit murder, therefore, is 5 minutes of madness. The most common murder that will take place in Britain is a young man falling out with a young man on a Friday or Saturday night when that young man feels he isn't being given the respect that he deserves. And when he feels that, and he is in the company of his friends, or indeed the friends of the person whom he feels has disrespected him, and he's been drinking too much or using other kinds of substances, he wants to lash out because he wants to regain a sense of who he is in that 5 minutes of madness. And he might not set out to kill, but he certainly is setting out to physically harm the person he believes has disrespected him. That is a typical murder in this country. It is still appalling that 2 women a week are murdered in this country by their partners or ex-partners, and that is about misogyny. That's a shameful statistic, but actually 7 out of 10 murder victims in the United Kingdom are men. 9 out of 10 perpetrators of murder are men. This is a male phenomenon, and this is about men owning that phenomenon, and it's about men in my generation talking to younger men about how to perform masculinity, which is something that men are very reluctant to do. And so we leave that discussion to social media influencers like the Tate brothers. And all that does is store up further problems for us in the future. But the main reason people commit murder in this country is because in 5 minutes of madness, a young man will lash out at another young man whom he feels has disrespected him. Why do some killers engage in post-mortem mutilation or cannibalism, i.e. Jeffrey Dahmer? So we're back to serial killers, we're back to serial murderers, although Dahmer, of course, isn't the only cannibal who has eaten the flesh of his victims. Part of the post-mortem mutilation is about their fantasy. It is about, again, an expression of power. Post-mortem mutilation is often about a kind of deep-seated inability to be human. It's about desecration of another person's body. For some of those killers, that desecration just thrills them. Why do people stalk others? I've spent a long time talking about murder and serial murder, my work in prisons with people who've committed appalling violent crimes. And I personally was stalked. I was stalked very badly. And this was when I worked at the university. I was being stalked by a former student of the university. Not that he was my former student, but I was stalked by a former student at the university. And he was paranoid schizophrenic. and he believed he had invaded the body of Sean Penn, and he believed I'd stolen his film script. And when he was barred from coming onto campus, he started to write letters and emails to me, in which he threatened to stab me and stab me and stab me until I was dead. So we had to alert campus security, the West Midlands Police, the West Midlands Mental Health Outreach Team, and I thought that was the end of it until about 6 weeks later in my office hours, he appeared in my office and said he'd come to pick up his film script. That was quite scary. And stalking, I always use the acronym FOUR: fixated, obsessive, unwanted, repetitive behavior. And sometimes stalkers are spurned lovers or old flames, and sometimes there's no relationship between, as in my case with this former student, not of mine, but of the university, there's no relationship at all. They just simply latch on to an individual. But the key thing I would say when I'm asked this question is that keep a diary, keep a note of how you're being stalked. Don't stay quiet about it. Talk to your family and friends about it. Raise it with the police. Give them access to the diary that you keep about the stalking behavior. And don't be afraid to ask for help. And the group that I normally advise in relation to stalking is the Susie Lamplugh Trust, which I think does amazing work, particularly to support women who are being stalked. What is an organised serial killer? I've often argued in line with some of the FBI original stuff that was written on this, that there are two groups, organised or disorganised serial killers. An organised serial killer is someone who has a very specific MO, modus operandi, is forensically aware, is often geographically mobile. By being geographically mobile, the serial killer will often cross police force boundary areas, and therefore that simple geography means that often they will evade detection. A disorganized serial killer is somebody who has the opposite to everything that I've just described, often geographically fixed, will not be forensically aware, will therefore leave lots of clues at the crime scene that can be harnessed and harvested by law enforcement. And a disorganized serial killer will just simply take the opportunity to kill, and therefore won't necessarily have a very fixed victim group that he is interested in killing. He simply accepts the opportunity to kill. Why do women fall in love with serial killers and become prison wives? At one level, this is a paraphilia fetish, and it's called hybristophilia. So there are some women and some men who are attracted to the cruelty of another person. So the cruelty, they don't want that cruelty inflicted on themselves, but they enjoy the idea of that cruelty being inflicted on an other person. Hybristophiliacs. There's also some women that I've met, especially when I was working with people who'd committed very violent crimes up to and including murder and serial murder. There was a sense in which some of them had savior complexes. They felt that, these kinds of violent men are safe. They're safe in one particular way. They're safe behind bars. There's clearly no sexual ability. They can't have sex in this country, so there's no conjugal visits. So there are complex reasons. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of how to answer that question. Each case will be unique and bring with it unique elements to it in terms of explaining why that should be the case. Why are so many serial killers in the medical profession? And obviously I've previously mentioned Lucy Letby and I've mentioned Harold Shipman. Well, part of it is about access to vulnerable people. If you're in the medical profession, people are vulnerable and you have a great deal of power over them because you are sick, you're seeking advice. So you go into a relationship with somebody that you might not have met before, a doctor or a nurse. You've gone into an institution that they're familiar with, a hospital that you're not. That person also will have access to drugs that can kill you. And so this is often about the ability to express power in those professions over people who are already vulnerable because they are unwell. The other profession, because you've mentioned medical profession there, the other profession that tends to dominate in terms of the work of British serial killers in particular are driving professions. There are a lot of delivery drivers, taxi drivers, lorry drivers. Obviously, you would be thinking of Peter Sutcliffe when I say that. But, you know, one of our worst murderers of children was Robert Black, who was a delivery driver. And driving, of course, allows the organised serial killer to cross police force boundary areas. So he might abduct in one part of the country, dispose of the body in another part of the country. He has a legitimate reason to be in places that at night that other people might not be in at night. You know, so driving professions dominate just as much as the medical profession, albeit, as I've acknowledged, our most prolific serial killer was a trusted local GP. In your opinion, what is the worst crime? Well, I think any crime that involves an abuse of trust, any crime that involves vulnerable victims who fall into a world in which that trust can be abused. So I do think the very young and the very elderly who meet people as a consequence of their youth or their age, who are then victimized, those are the worst crimes. And then there are specific things beyond that which make a crime even worse for me. I was asked about organised and disorganised, but that wouldn't be the problem for me next. It would be those offenders who are process motivated and those offenders who are act motivated. An act motivated offender simply commits the crime. A process motivated offender enjoys the commission of the crime, and therefore they will prolong the time in which the victim is being tortured. I always think of Dennis Nielsen in that respect because, of course, Nielsen would choke or attempt to drown some of his victims only to revive them so he could do it again. So for me, it's process-motivated offenders who use the opportunity of trust that they have in our culture to gain access to vulnerable people and then abuse that trust. Why am I so obsessed with true crime? I always say that, you know, an interest in true crime is not just explicable, it's necessary. Because if you understand the circumstances in which you are liable to fall victim to crime, you can avoid those circumstances. And it's necessary in our public policy, because if we can identify the circumstances in which people are more likely to fall victim to crime, then in our public policy, we can alter what it is that has created those vulnerabilities. I'd also say there, obviously, and again, I go back to my students. I would have 4 out of 5 of my students would be women as opposed to men. And again, it seems to me through evolutionary psychology that women, of course, women are going to be more interested in true crime because so often it's women that have to manage the violence of men. So why wouldn't they want to know in what circumstances is this man likely to be violent? I suppose the other thing that I touch upon quite a lot in my TV work, when I'm doing podcasts, but there's another level of true crime, superior true crime, prestige true crime, which is really trying to use our interest in crime to talk about very serious subjects that often don't get discussed in our culture. serial killers in our culture have only targeted 5 groups of people. It's not about entering the mind of a serial killer. It's thinking about, well, why are those 5 groups so vulnerable to attack? 4 of those groups that serial killers will target in the United Kingdom are dominated by women and girls. There's only 1 group of men that by and large gets targeted by serial killers, and those are gay men. And the 2 groups of women or girls that are most regularly targeted by serial killers are women over the age of 60 and sex workers. So just think about that for a second. If you really wanted to reduce the incidence of serial murder in our culture, you would challenge homophobia, you'd have a grown-up debate about how we police those young women and some young men who sell sexual services. And above all, we would start trying to give a voice to older people in our culture, as opposed to seeing them as a burden on the state. That's when true crime really becomes not just interesting, but absolutely necessary, absolutely important. What do you enjoy about your job? I enjoy lots about my job. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I get to meet people and I get to go into institutions, meet the staff, meet the people who are being locked up there, and I get to contribute to a public debate. And it's that public debate that I really enjoy. I've enjoyed talking to LADbible because for me, if I can harness your interest in the subject area, there's so much we can do to reduce the levels of violence in our society. And for all those people who are fascinated by serial murders, don't fall for the medical psychological tradition. Fall instead for the structural tradition. And that structural tradition involves us thinking about why are these groups constantly predated upon by serial killers? Why is it gay men? Why is it sex workers? And why is it older women in our culture? And therefore, if you want to do something to reduce the incidence of serial murder, you challenge homophobia, because that creates the vulnerability that serial killers exploit to kill gay men. You have a grown-up debate about how we police those young women and some young men who sell sexual services in the street. If we started having that honest discussion, I'm absolutely convinced we would reduce the typical amount of murder that takes place in the United Kingdom.
I think that there are prisoners in the women's estate who will think nothing of trying to get a trophy like Lucy Letby. There are some serious prisoners locked up in the female estate who would have a go in the blink of an eye